Hello there, my very good friends. Andy Murray here for What Culture Wrestling, and what better time of year than spooky season itself to sit here and rank every single WCW Halloween Havoc pay-per-view. That's exactly what we're going to do today, and it's particularly relevant at the moment as well because this year WWE brought the bloody concept back, didn't they? They had the NXT special, it was all dandy, it was all lovely, it was beautiful, beautiful, wacky, silly stuff. And you know, that's what this pay-per-view is all about. The history of Halloween Havoc is not littered with amazing 5-star classics here, there, and everywhere. There have been a few of those, as we'll talk about. But no, this pay-per-view's appeal has always been something different. It's silly, it's kitschy, it's weird, it's often nonsense. But that's part of the fun, and that's primarily how we're going to judge this thing today. I can't sit here and go, hey, well, this show had 4-star matches and this had 2 5s. That doesn't really apply to a pay-per-view as weird as Halloween Havoc. How much fun is the damn thing to watch? How goofy is it? And yes, we will have consideration for the top level matches, but let's be honest, there's not a great deal of those in Halloween Havoc history. Anyway, let's get this show on the goddamn road. I'm Andy for What Culture Wrestling, and this is every WCW Halloween Havoc pay-per-view ranked from worst to best. At number 12, the Dirt Worst 1999. It shouldn't come as a huge surprise to all you watching at home that this was actually the first Halloween Havoc pay-per-view that one Vincent Russo got his claws on, and yeah, I mean, all the hallmarks of his booking are pretty much everywhere on this horrendous wrestling show. The closest thing to good on this card was a serviceable match between Eddie Guerrero and Perry Saturn, but even that had a crap ending, with Ric Flair coming down to brain Eddie with a crowbar and then steal a kiss off of Billy Kidman's other half, Torrie Wilson, just to remind you that yes, this was a gross era of sports entertainment. And Sting had a particularly terrible night on this evening. First of all, he had a scheduled match with Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan comes down after much delay. He's wearing street clothes and he lies down for him in the middle of the ring. And as if that wasn't bad enough, you had Sting going up against Goldberg, United States Champion versus WCW Champion. It was billed as non-title. But it wasn't non-title. Sting lost in 3 minutes, Goldberg was declared the new champion, and everybody was bloody confused. And I don't want to spend too much time on this pay-per-view because it's not an enjoyable watch at all. The bad stuff on this show is unwatchably bad. It's not funny bad, it's not so bad it's good, it's I'm cancelling everything to do with wrestling in my life because this goddamn thing sucks. Avoid. Number 11, 2000. This show, I believe, is currently the lowest rated WCW pay-per-view on the popular website Cage Match, and you know, while that isn't the be-all end-all, obviously I've got 1999 below it, this thing is a hellscape. And the closest thing to good on it is the opening match. It's a three-way tag featuring the Natural Born Thrillers. The rest of it, it sucks. This was the night, of course, of the many faces of Sting. We came into this event promised that Sting was going to be changed in somehow. And that meant him wrestling Jeff Jarrett as a bunch of former versions of himself. A bunch of dudes came out. We got Surfer Sting, we got Crow Sting, we got every Sting you can bloody think of. And it culminated with the real Sting coming from beneath the ring, having dragged Jeff Jarrett down there like he's Kane, and then just like winning the match after he's already come across 4 other Stings. How many Stings does one need on one show? There was a match between The Perfect Event and the Misfits in Action on this show that, I mean, gee whiz, you watch this thing and you wouldn't even know that a couple of these guys, Lash LaRue in particular, were actually being paid to be professional wrestlers. The level of effort is akin to a slug walking towards a salt factory. Then there's Shane Douglas and Torrie Wilson against Conan and Tigress, which featured 2 people who, you know, had their skills as performers, but legitimately, literally, couldn't wrestle. And they were in this match on the pay-per-view. We had a First Blood DNA match that revolved around David Flair wanting to get a sample of Buff Bagwell's blood so he could prove whether or not Buff Bagwell had slept with his missus. And then, to make matters worse, In the main event, you get Goldberg just needlessly squashing Chronic 2-on-1, thus kind of decapitating one of WCW's only marketable acts left. This show stinks. Doesn't stink as bad as 1999, but boy, these were a rough couple of years. Number 10, 1998. Here we are then, the long-awaited rematch between two legends of the game, the Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan. Now, to give you an indication of this match's quality, I think I'll borrow a few quotes here from some prominent wrestling media figures at the time. Dave Meltzer of the Wrestling Observer, -5 stars. It was also voted his website's worst match of the year. Power Slam editor Finn Martin called it one of the worst matches ever held. Even Mean Gene Okerlund said it was a disaster. And Andy Murray of What Culture Wrestling says it was a hurricane of piss. This was just a horrendous, uncooperative match between two guys who really had no real business working this kind of main event in the first place at this specific point in time, and it was marred by a disastrous finish that Hogan came up with himself. He had some flash paper he was going to light the Ultimate Warrior up with a fireball, but it ended up backfiring, didn't it? He fired himself in the face and singed his eyebrows and his mustache. To be fair, Hulk took the blame for this after the show, but it was a nightmare. And to top this pay-per-view off, well, the main event was cut off before it finished. WCW ran out of time. They forgot to inform their pay-per-view provider that DDP versus Goldberg was going to stretch the show towards 3.5 hours. That meant that they had to show what was actually a really good title match on Nitro the following evening. But that is an objective disaster, so I have to have this whole deal at number 10. Number 9, 1990. So if you're like me and you've watched this show on the WWE Network, it's actually not the full event. They cut 3 singles match and a tag match, so you're not getting a full review, a full look at the entire show as a whole. But, you know, I've tracked down one of the cut matches, Junkyard Dog versus Moondog Rex on YouTube, and to be fair, the cuts are probably for the best. Even in its edited form, though, this is just kind of a nothing pay-per-view. I mean, I got a particularly large kick out of the Steiner brothers versus the Nasty Boys. It's kind of like the Steiners at their peak jock level, beefy, going nuts, dropping dudes on their head, meeting the Nasty Boys, who on their day, they get a lot of flack, of course, and understandably, but they were pretty great brawlers, and that was a good tag match. But the whole thing is just rounded off by this really lackluster main event between Sting and Sid Vicious that has an interference from the Four Horsemen and fake Sting as well, years before that was really a thing. It's boring. That's one word for this show, man. Boring. You don't need to see it. Number 8, 1992. So this is where the whole spin the wheel, make the deal gimmick came along, and well, the first entry didn't do it a whole lot of favors. It was Sting, it was Jake Roberts. The gimmick they ended up with was a coal miner's glove match, and this is one of the most criticized matches in pay-per-view main events from this era of WCW. It's basically a glorified on a pole match, and at the end you get the weird sight of Jake kind of trying to coax his snake to bite him in the face, even though it looks like the snake can't really be arsed. It's a mess. But fortunately, they would outdo it with the next spin the wheel match. Also, on top of this, you've got a really dreadful match, the kind of match that'll have you questioning your fandom, between Masahiro Chono and Rick Rude. It's slow, they're wrestling in molasses, there's no heat, there's no urgency, there's no real connective tissue between anything they're doing. It's a stodge fest, it is a stall fest, any other kind of fest you can think of that means boring. I would be remiss not to mention that there is some pretty good stuff in the first half of the show. There's a really good Ricky the Dragon Steamboat versus Brian Pillman match, for example, but you know, that's greatly outnumbered by everything else, and the rest of the show just isn't really notable enough to mention. Number 7, 1991, and behold, the all-time so bad it's good classic, The Chamber of Horrors. The pay-per-view opened with this, which is kind of ridiculous. It was a big crazy cell match, big multi-man affair. There was coffins, all kinds of ridiculous stuff, Halloween-themed nonsense all over the ring, and the goal was to strap a member of the opposing team into an electric chair and electrocute them. Kayfabe murder to finish an opening match on a pay-per-view. How could you not love that? And of course, it's one of the great all-time botched finishes as well, as Mick Foley electrocuted his own teammate, Abdullah the Butcher. From there, the card is boringly competent, unfortunately, although there is a match between Steve Austin and Dustin Rhodes that you should really check out, because, I mean, Dustin Rhodes is 2020 now, and he's still great. The guy's immortal. There's a pretty rancid stretch of matches after that, but hey, if you want to see the novelty of Kevin Nash wrestling as Oz, it is right there for you, brother. And in the main event, you know, Ron Simmons enters a pretty high effort performance against Lex Luger, who looked like he couldn't be arsed. There's that as well. It's not as disastrous as some of the other shows, and I love the Chamber of Horrors, but if you hate the Chamber of Horrors, this is probably one of your least favorites. Still, I think you should just smile, man. Sometimes train wrecks are as good as 5-star classics. Number 6, 1994. Famously, we never got Ric Flair versus Hulk Hogan in the WWF, but we got it here. This was their second big match in WCW, and a clear step up for me from their Clash of the Champions battle. They were in a steel cage, and it was really overbooked. There was interferences, Mr. T was there, all kinds of stuff going on. But in a way, it was scripted so damn well that it was perfect pro wrestling theatre, the kind of pomp and circumstance that WCW and the WWF excelled at various points in their history. It's well worth watching again in 2020, and yeah, it really elevates this show. But the thing about this match, the problem with it, is that the masked man who had been plaguing Hulk Hogan and attacking him and so forth in the build-up was revealed to be Brother Bruty after the match was over. So, in typical WCW fashion, they took a good thing and found a way to make it feel like a bad thing. There isn't a whole lot elsewhere on the card that's really worth going back to. I guess it's kind of like a one-match show, but that one match is very, very strong. Just for the love of God, stay the hell away from Dave Sullivan versus Kevin Sullivan. You will thank me later. Number 5, 1996. I'm going to be a good little work rate nerd for a second and point out that the best thing on this card was Rey Mysterio Jr. Cruiserweight versus Dean Malenko. Now, of course, this division provided much of WCW's highlights throughout those last 5 or so years, and this is no exception. It's not going to pop your eyeballs out like some of Rey's other classics, one of which we'll talk about later on, but it's a really good match, and it holds up today. Dean is great as this methodical technician trying to grind Rey down, trying to keep him out of the skies, and even at this point, 25 years ago, Rey is just phenomenal, particularly on offense. It's a great match, and it's well worth watching. Other highlights are not as strong as that one, but Chris Jericho in 6, X-Pac, had a very good match on the mid-card. There's a nice Harlem Heat bout here as well. And you know, Eddie Guerrero and DDP, they work very intensely against each other. It's heated, it feels gritty, but it is undermined somewhat by a few moments of sloppiness. And unfortunately, the main event between Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage, it's not as bad as the Hogan Warrior match from 4 years later, but again, these guys are just so far removed from their primes at this point, and the smoke and mirrors just don't land. It feels like a stodgy, overbooked mess. There's Nick Patrick doing his crooked official stuff, a whole bunch of other garbage, and then a really nonsensical Roddy Piper promo to close the show. A sour ending, not a terrible show all round, but a sour ending nonetheless. Number 4, 1989. So this was the very first Halloween Havoc event. It was subtitled Settling the Score, and it was a rather middling show up to the point where we got Lex Luger in the midst of one of the best years of his career, putting the United States title on the line against Brian Pillman. It's a good little match that sparks a nice upturn in quality, but the real highlight of this show is the original Thunderdome. I'm talking Ric Flair and Sting versus Terry Funk and the Great Muta with, get this, Bruno Sammartino as referee. Weird. But this is a really good match. It's not quite as iconic or classic as some of the War Games matches, for example, but I mean, it's an electrified cage. You get these dudes hitting off it, zapping totally hamming the whole thing up, overacting all over the place. It's silly, but it's a lot of fun. It's a good match and a great way to wrap the long-term feud between Flair and Funk, who had an incredible match at that year's Great American Bash. Check that one out as well. Number 3, 1993. So this is where the spin the wheel, make the deal came good. It was Big Van Vader, it was Cactus Jack in the main event of the first truly great Halloween Havoc pay-per-view, and they got a Texas death match. Now, even if you've never seen this match before, thinking about the participants and the stipulation, you can probably imagine what this was, right? And you'd be correct. It was violent, it was ugly, it was attritional, it was ghoulish, it was everything I like personally in professional wrestling. It is one of the great brawls of the period and a class match. There's plenty of other really good stuff on this really good show as well. You've got Paul Orndorff versus Ricky Steamboat and a great United States title clash between Steve Austin and Dustin Rhodes. The one major disappointment, I think, is the match between Ric Flair and Rick Rude, which just has no real connective tissue between the big moments in it, including a whole bunch of referee-based shenanigans. It's a real shame considering the legendary participants, but you know, if you're let down by that, the Shockmaster's on this pay-per-view and he's actually wrestling, so there's your so bad it's good appeal to go with the legitimately great main event. It's a really good show. Number 2, 1995. I'm telling you right now, we've got to forget about the earnestly good matches on this card. Forget about Sabu versus Mr. JL or DDP versus Johnny B. Bad. Hey, even forget about the quite bad matches that Randy Savage wrestled on this show. This show is second on my list because the disasters are hilarious. Halloween Havoc 1995 is home to some of the most preposterous bollocks ever done on a WCW show, and think of all the ground that covers. I'm talking about one of the most hilariously forecasted Ric Flair turns in history, making Sting look like the most gullible man alive. I'm talking about the monster truck sumo match on the roof of the building, after which the bloody Hulk Hogan murdered the Giant by throwing him off the roof. The Giant no-sells death and comes back for the main event. And speaking of that main event, what happened after it? The Yeti! This was, of course, peak era Dungeon of Doom nonsense. It was the Yeti, as he was supposed to be called, even though he looks like a bloody mummy, coming down, getting between, sandwiching Hulk Hogan between him and the Giant, humping Hulk Hogan to death. Somehow Hulk Hogan's lost the WCW title because his manager, Jimmy Hart, attacked the referee, but the belt gets stripped from the Giant. There's a whole lot of booking bollocks that you have to sift through here, but trust me, if you're a drinking person, dedicate a few hours of your life to firing up the network, popping a couple of cans, and just wallowing in the perfect pro wrestling catastrophe. The Yeti! And at number 1, 1997. This is not a one-match show, but you cannot mention Halloween Havoc 1997 and not just immediately talk about Rey Mysterio versus Eddie Guerrero. On this show, these dudes had genuinely one of the greatest cruiserweight matches of all time. This was a futuristic, state-of-the-art, ahead of its time clash between a tremendous heel in Eddie Guerrero. This is one of Eddie's best performances, particularly as a heel, and a tremendous babyface as well in Rey Mysterio, who bumps like crazy, sells like a nut job, and his offense, of course, is gonna melt your goddamn brain. This looks good even 23 years later. After all the innovation that has come between then and now, this still holds up. Watch it. If you've never seen it, you need to. There's also a ripper of an opener between Ultimo Dragon and Yuji Nagata, who still wrestles today, the madman. And on top of that, Randy Savage versus DDP was heated, gritty, and felt like a fight. Plus, on top of that, Steve Mongo McMichael wrestles on this card and gets killed by Big Bloody Goldberg, so that's always a riot. There isn't much to a match like Disco Inferno wrestling Jacqueline, but it's kind of funny watching Disco kind of grapple internally with the thought of having to hit a woman. He makes it kind of entertaining. And then there's the main event, which, well, I guess you were wondering where the so bad it's entertaining comes in. Here it is. This is a totally stupid enclosed steel cage match between Hulk Hogan and Roddy Piper, which of course is one of the most iconic wrestling feuds of all time, but not here, brothers. And if the match isn't bad enough for you, check the closing angle, the post-match angle, which involves Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage beating up a fan dressed as Sting for some reason. Okay, but it kind of sums up that this pay-per-view is the essence of Halloween Havoc. It is a genuinely fun watch with great wrestling on one side and silly nonsense on the other. What more could you really want? But anyway guys, that's it. My Halloween Havoc rankings are done, but as always, I want to know what you guys think. Hit up the comment section, let us know. Once you've done, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications. Then you can follow us on Twitter at WhatCultureWWE and myself at Andy H. Murray. You can tell me how wrong I am. Goodbye.